Democrat. As I define it, social democracy is a political, social, and economic philosophy within the socialist tradition. As an economic ideology and policy regime, it's described by academics as advocating economic and social interventions to promote social justice within the framework of a liberal democratic and a capitalist-oriented mixed economy, i.e., an economic system that uses welfare, egalitarian policies, and efforts to put systematically disenfranchised people on the same launchpad as everyone else when building themselves up and contributing to an economy with an emphasis on democratic ownership of firms as modes to attain desired financial status and quality of life. I and many others believe that every individual should have the fair ability to build themselves up in a market system where they get a say in how they do it. Now, I can already see what you're rushing to type in the comments. To anyone unfamiliar with the theory, it might sound like a utopian, idealistic dream, unachievable anywhere in the near future, but anyone thinking that or even remotely interested in such economics, I'd ask you to take this into consideration. It's no question that the American capitalistic system as it exists today is fundamentally structured to consolidate wealth and power, along with so much of American infrastructure, relationships, and social systems being products of innately exploitative and discriminatory practices. Take this video from Politizane, visually illustrating the absurdity of wealth distribution in America from 2012.
That ideal we asked everyone about, something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by.
This bar graph from the Federal Reserve in 2013 shows an even more staggering figure and how much the top 10%'s collective net worth has gone up precipitously from 1998 to earlier last decade. But those numbers are infinitesimal compared to class differences today. Take this proportional bubble chart from the World Inequality Database. The 3 richest individuals have a Goliath amount compared to the 1%'s average, proving even they're becoming profusely poor to the point where you can't even see the amount the average American has in net worth. worth. That the net worth those people hold are mostly made up of shares in corporations listed on the stock market, and they can't sell many of them due to security price volatility. Take Musk's company, in which the average share sells for $774 at the time of recording this. To recognize the amount of shares traded today, let's look at the volume. Yeah, real risky for him to sell off his shares, which he owns 170 million of. The fundamental problem here is how shareholder corporations work, and by extension capitalism as a system, because in such a market economy, decision-making and investments are determined by owners of wealth, property, production ability in capital and financial markets, whereas prices and the distribution of goods and services are mainly determined by competition in goods and services markets. This is especially evident in the way people that already have disposable income invest into corporate entities. Typically, an angel investor, seed investor, or venture capitalist puts a lump sum of money into a company in exchange for shares in that company, which typically translates to voting power. Anybody could realize that this already benefits the investor exponentially because there's no underlying merit in buying into a project, which is then only rendered inhumane by exploitative working conditions. Don't believe me when I say investors don't have merit in their securities? Well then, this chart from Brookings makes it manifestly clear that most of the people that are financially successful long-term already had those privileges simply because they were born into it, which is perfectly complemented by this from the UBS Wealth Report, and the fact that in social democracies, the richest people are self-made. So you'd be blatantly lying to yourself if you said social democracy wasn't demonstrably more meritocratic. I profusely encourage any skeptic to actually look into how investments in shareholder corporations work, and specifically the leverage investors have over the basic working conditions and by extension lives of the working class. On an even more dismal note, an intersectional perspective posits that exploitative worker practices show disparities based on race and gender, bolstered by perpetual cycles of financial disenfranchisement, but that's not a push towards a black pill. Only the most reactionary of libertarians and free market adulators won't say our economic system needs fundamental reform, so here's a prescription of how, systemically, we could economically improve. The Nordic model is the combination of social welfare and economic systems adopted by the Nordic countries. It combines features of capitalism such as market economy and economic efficiency with social benefits such as state pensions and income distribution. It seeks to promote true meritocracy and ethical entrepreneurship via providing social welfare services, which paves the way in emphasis of workforce participation. Since most of the preposterously rich make their money off of dividends or stock buybacks, and the capital gains tax is substantially lower than income, investors have an incentive to keep their money in those securities for at least a year and a day, qualifying them for even more tax benefits. However, the Nordic countries have noticeably higher capital gains tax rates than most of the countries in the developed world, paving their way for public infrastructure projects and essential government services like universal healthcare. Another way we could greatly reform wealth redistribution in this country is to tax loans as income for people at a certain net worth threshold. As a part of the buy, borrow, die strategy, many people who let the value of their intangible assets accumulate borrow loans to supplement their disposable income in that moment with their stock as collateral. As a regimented system of economic reform, especially going to those who need it the most, how could you be against such a thing? How could you not even think this was the most pragmatic system? How could you not think this has been verifiably proven to be the most economically viable solution? You can't. Is it really any wonder why the Nordic countries rank highest on financial mobility indexes? Time and time again, they top lists that index quality of life, and I'm honestly pinching myself and trying to convince my mind that what I'm living in is a fever dream due to the fact that we're moving towards progressive policies as if the institutions for reform have been lobotomized, as if they're on a heroin molasses cocktail. It's that bureaucratic. There's no doubt in my mind nearly every American wants to level the socioeconomic playing field so everyone who comes here in search of an opportunity to fulfill their desired goals. But how are we going to achieve such a thing if there's legislative, systemic, and ideological barriers preventing us from doing so? Isn't that the American dream? We don't have to abandon a market system, so if you're in support of reform to let the true value producers build themselves up in society, don't distort what's crystal clear and right in front of you. Because you're for equal opportunity, you are a social democrat.